Twice per annum, Elwood Addington Thrush engaged in what he called his Grand Purge. On April 23rd and November 16th, dates chosen for obscure reasons kept strictly to himself, various things among the accumulated flotsam of his cluttered existence would be meticulously exhumed from the farthest reaches of his closets and drawers, and extricated with an almost surgical precision from the deepest recesses of the attic and basement. All would then be gathered together into a great pile in the middle of his vast living room, piles of luggage and mountains of clothes, boxes and bags all thrown on the pile, books and trinkets as well as 1,000 small mementos of a life, his alone and solitary. These would be considered silently for 1 hour, no more, no less. During this time nothing would be touched, handled, or reflected upon in its own particularity. After this hour of considered reflection had expired, the nature and contents of which he never disclosed to anyone, nor wrote down the least report, the pile would be unsentimentally consigned to a huge industrial waste bin Thrush rented from a local contractor and had placed discreetly toward the back of his modest acreage. All would then be carted away to an undisclosed destination. This purge typically, and in some quarters notoriously, included not only objects both priceless and common, but extended without mercy to persons as well, and included both those occupying the outer fringes of his minor acquaintance, as well as those placed much closer to the seat of his most intimate and private affairs. It came then as absolutely no surprise to Friedrich and Mathilde Eloise when Thrush left detailed instructions on the ancient salver outside their quarters on the night of November 15th, charging them to lay another place setting at the table in the formal dining room for breakfast the next morning. They were to spare no effort or expense in the preparation of the early morning repast, to be taken just after the first light, behind closed doors, with no interruptions of any sort to be tolerated for any reason short of imminent loss of life or limb to either themselves or the portly canine companion of advanced age who shared the Thrush household. What did come as something of a shock to the elderly pair, long used to a diverse and unpredictable assemblage of eccentricities of manner and taste in their employer, was the guest's identity. Thrush's daughter, Violet Marie Constance, a person the elder Thrush had not seen nor had any sort of contact with for over 40 years. Friedrich and Mathilde Eloise were in the kitchen when the doorbell finally emitted its solitary sonorous note that vibrated throughout the entire house and into the farthest wings of the massive structure. Mattie, as Friedrich referred to his wife privately and out of hearing range of their employer, shot a pensive glance at her husband, and he returned her gaze, holding it for a full 10 seconds before releasing it as he set the silver tray with its formal service back onto the marble countertop. Mathilde Eloise wiped her hands nervously on her linen apron and glanced towards the front of the house, but said nothing, merely illustrating the tone of the moment with a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. After straightening his crisp jacket and tugging the point snugly into place, pressed flat and centered against his narrow, wiry frame, Friedrich glided silently, and with dignity seldom witnessed outside the Thrush residence, towards the entry hall where he pulled open the massive ornamental iron door to receive the guest. Stepping back against the interior flank of the stone entryway, and assuming a stiffened attitude of attention, eyes locked straight ahead, and not looking directly at the woman herself, Friedrich awaited further instructions or developments. Violet Marie Constance Thrush nodded once, sharply, whether to Friedrich as a sort of greeting or to the house itself for unknown reasons remained unclear. She stepped over the ancient mosaic threshold as the first rays of misty pre-dawn penetrated the stained glass windows in the foyer. She paused there for a moment before carefully removing her calf-length camel hair cape, suede gloves of the same precise hue, and green felt hunter's hat, complete with 2 crisp pheasant plumes over 16 inches in length, then wordlessly draped them over Friedrich's waiting arm. Then she pulled off her dark glasses and proceeded to examine the entry hall, her knuckled index finger tapping thoughtfully against her pursed lips. Eyes narrowed and beady, she raked with extreme care over every surface and detail within view. "Something is different," she said slowly, not glancing at Friedrich, but continuing her studied consideration of each surface, object, and architectural detail, drawing from a long-faded memory of the place and attempting to understand the current vision with an adult's eye for the very first time. "A great deal, Miss Thrush," came a hollow yet musical voice from the adjoining Turkish salon, "has changed." The senior Thrush stepped lightly into view from behind the faded rose velvet draperies and beheld his daughter with his usual guarded demeanor, hands clasped firmly before him just below the waist. His great height and lean unstooped frame remained as imposing in command as when they'd last met, in this very house, so many decades ago, and under circumstances not disposed to inspire fond memories in the warmest of reunions. "This way, please," Thrush said curtly, stepping aside as he and Violet Marie Constance disappeared into the vast spaces of the formal dining room, where the massive chandelier and numerous ornate sconces had been set alight, illuminating the ancient walls and carved ceiling with a flickering, buttery glow. "Friedrich, I believe we're ready to be served now," Thrush instructed as he closed the towering carved double doors behind him, sealing himself and his final surviving offspring into familial privacy before the dusty imperviousness of the family crest where it commanded a place of prominence some 10 feet above over the mantel of the fireplace. "Very good, sir," whispered the manservant as he turned and went to rejoin his wife in the kitchen. It was Christmas Eve, some 40 years prior to the events of the somewhat reserved reunion between Thrush and his daughter Violet Marie Constance on the morning of November 16th. Alas, but the stockings were not hung by the chimney with care, and St. Nick, long considered by Thrush to be a wholly frivolous encumbrance on the critical formative years of childhood, had been summarily banished to the abodes of lesser children in the neighborhood. To the mind of Elwood Addington Thrush, his progeny were to be more suitably occupied and consumed by matters of undeniable intellectual gravity and import such as a close study of the classics, the venerable arts of antiquity and the Renaissance, and preparation for productive livelihoods in law, medicine, the academy, and needless to state, the continuation of the Thrush family name. This last was to be achieved with the assistance of suitable youth to be carefully selected by Thrush and certain of his confederates among the old guard of his club. But on this particular Christmas Eve, the Thrush family would dine modestly in the smaller dining room, on lamb with shallots and white wine, and various hearty accompaniments as Mathilde Eloise found on hand in the pantry. She had purchased, at her own personal expense, a number of pine garlands and arranged them attractively over the small white marble fireplace, and Friedrich had brought candy and a few small gifts for the children. Thrush had looked upon these displays and grunted approvingly, but had said nothing. He had done his duty to the season by placing generous yearly envelopes on the salver outside of the door to his servants' quarters. As for the children and Felicity, his wife, Thrush had provided a hearty meal, prepared by the best staff his robust resources could afford, and Friedrich would be driving them to church at the end of the evening. Tomorrow was another day. They would eat the remains of this meal or the offerings of another. The heady pine scent of Mathilde's garlands would amuse the children, and then they would move swiftly and with purpose toward the new year. As they sat together in the grand salon, waiting for Friedrich to call them in to dinner, Felicity stood at the window, admiring her favorite sight, the unobstructed view of the Hudson River on its silent march towards the waiting arms of Manhattan and the sea beyond. 3 of Elwood and Felicity's 4 daughters, Amelia Cecile, Violet Marie Constance, and Daphne Alice, sat before the roaring fire playing whist, a game much favored by the Thrush women, and eyeing the box of confection sitting on the table that had been strictly designated for after dinner only. The snow had begun to fall earlier in the day, and now lay as a 3-feet-thick blanket over the rose garden and the walking path, while the tree branches sagged heavily under its powdery weight. This had put Felicity into a festive mood that utterly baffled and clearly irked her husband. "My dearest, why on this earth would you rejoice in something that only makes for dreary and dangerous work for our Friedrich? It's highly unthinking of you, and I hope you will refrain from such childish displays in the future, or confine this silliness to the children's rooms," Thrush admonished, glancing at Felicity and shaking his head as she continued to gaze at the river. "You could at least look at your husband when he speaks to you in such a tone. It reflects poorly on my authority," he grumbled. "No one questions your authority in this house, my dear Thrush," she began lightly, turning to look at him and coming to sit at his side on the divan. "It is well known and thoroughly understood," she continued, patting his arm affectionately. "Now, would it be possible, do you think, for Friedrich to drive our girls and me up Route 9 to look at the snow and, well, the houses? You know, I love seeing how people decorate at this time of year," she asked hopefully. "Yes, certainly," Thrush replied, happy for the occasion to bestow permission where he suspected more and more that none was truly required. "And perhaps Mathilde Eloise, might she go as well?" "Oh yes, please," the girls cried out happily. "If the house is in proper order," Thrush replied sternly, "and Friedrich does not require some task of her in the kitchens, and you are away for no more than 2 hours, then yes," he concluded firmly, glaring at them as though they had all gone mad. "And where is Augusta Clarice? Call her. We'll be dining shortly, and I don't want to be seated at the table waiting for her again. It happens with altogether far too much frequency, and I want it stopped," Thrush said angrily, as the 3 other girls got up and ran from the room in search of their sister. Just a few moments later, the service bell rang outside the salon door, and Thrush stood up, believing it to be the call that dinner could be served at the family's leisure. Instead, after the customary count to 10, the door swung open and Friedrich entered and walked up to where Thrush stood. "A word, sir, if I might," Friedrich said in a hushed tone while gesturing toward the door. Yes, Friedrich, we'll dine now, as soon as my daughter deems us worthy of her company. Her siblings are even now in search of her." "Sir, a word, if you please," the manservant said curtly, his eyes stark with such frantic emotion that Thrush, startled, glanced at his wife and then followed Friedrich out the door without a word. "What is it, man?" Thrush demanded, his face a mask of anger and confusion. "Out with it, if—" His words trailed off as he saw the tear welling up in Friedrich's eye. "Come," Friedrich whispered hoarsely, and then quickly led the way to the mezzanine observatory above the 2nd floor, where the wooden metal door, like that of a fortress vault, stood ajar, and one of the great door-sized windows beyond lay wide open, allowing the icy winds to violently tear at the draperies and already leaving a considerable pile of snow on the floor beneath. "I just came up here to check the doors, sir. I felt the cold air and realized the window was open, so Naturally, sir. She had already fallen before I got here. Look, sir." Friedrich choked. "See there? She's almost completely covered with snow. She could not have survived such a fall from this height. Sir, I'm so sorry. We must go down and get her," he continued, tugging gently at Thrush's coat sleeve where he stood immobile, staring down at the small form of his youngest child, 12-year-old Augusta Clarice, her body broken and lying at a horrible angle far below. "How?" Thrush gasped, and visibly staggered. "I don't understand." Then he heard the scream of his wife behind him as she clung violently to his arm and peered out the window. Within an hour, the body of Augusta Clarice was indoors, wrapped in blankets by the fire. By the time they reached her, her body was cold and lifeless. Thrush had waded through the deep drifting snow and lifted his daughter gently, cradling her body in his arms as he made his way into the formal salon where her mother and sister sat huddled together, sobbing. Elwood Addington Thrush could not bear it. He had dared to entertain the secret in his heart that Augusta Clarice was his favorite. In sharp contrast to the irreproachable equanimity and charm of the other 3 Thrush young ladies, Augusta Clarice was bold and defiant. She was an explorer of attics and riverfronts. She was a teller of incredible, and incredibly preposterous and entertaining, lies. She was a hider from Mathilde Eloise and a consummate avoider of tasks, the sort of tasks that build character in a young woman and ensure she is never vain or withdrawn. The prankish girl had been a recalcitrant thorn in her mother's ordered and peaceful daily routine, and she had made everyone laugh in a household that was, by its very nature and careful design, reserved and distant from the baser sentiments that constrain the lives of lesser citizens among the rank and file. Augusta Clarice, from the earliest age, had been a dresser-up in ridiculous get-ups culled from the attic, and a putter-on of shows, demonstrations, antics, and wild displays of unpredictable and youthful chicanery. And this, Thrush had known in a heartbeat, was what had drawn his daughter out onto the precarious ledge outside of the open window of the observatory on the night of the first blizzard of the year. In short, Augusta Clarice was absolutely everything that Thrush himself, as well as the more obedient and compliant members of his familiar entourage, was not and could never be, and he had secretly loved her for this, as he loved no other person in his life, and she had never known. Mathilde Eloise dried the body and dressed her in clean clothes and then brushed her long hair at Thrush's instruction. She had sent the girls to their rooms and tried, without success, to urge their mother to take some warm milk. The dinner sat cold in the kitchen. Friedrich paced with worry. Thrush attempted several times to elicit some small reply from his wife, who lay half-draped on the divan, either willfully ignoring her husband or unable to respond to his entreaties. After some hours of this, Felicity composed herself and rose stiffly, then dried her eyes. She announced calmly that she was going to bed and issued a muffled, cool "good night" to her husband. Thrush turned to follow her, but then considered her closed and silent demeanor and decided to remain behind. It had always been their custom to maintain separate sleeping quarters at opposite ends of the house, with the children amply situated between them. After dismissing Friedrich and Mathilde Eloise for the evening and accepting their distraught condolences and tears, Thrush retired to his manly quarters with a snifter and a bottle of cognac, a libation whose company he rarely sought, but which always seemed to induce a reliably deep slumber after only a glass or 2. He was awakened to the sound of a great commotion below, and numerous voices in various states of distress and command. He leapt from his bed at the sound of unknown male voices, and looked out the window. There were unfamiliar vehicles, 3 late-model sedans and a small unmarked van in the driveway. He could see Friedrich was out in the front of the house, clearly directing traffic, as numerous persons, complete strangers, shuttled back and forth between the waiting vehicles and the front door that lay wide open, casting the full light of the foyer and entry hall in the blanket of snow and the chaotic network of footprints that ruptured and dirtied its pristine surface. Thrush quickly donned his dressing gown and slippers and hurried downstairs, exercising just enough decorum and control of his person as was required in the presence of strangers and unknown goings-on in his home in the middle of the night, the nature of which clearly involved both the complicity of his wife and children, and his complete ignorance for their successful completion. Barreling down the stairs, his indignity and rage fully alight, Thrush came to a halt before the open towering double doors of the formal salon, clearly the seat of command for the current campaign of affairs. It was then that he peered into the center of the great salon and beheld it, an image so startling and momentous in its scope and import that it would embed itself indelibly upon his psyche and inscribe the very fabric of the remainder of his days with its memory. The great mound of stuff, piles of luggage and mountains of clothes, boxes and bags all thrown in the pile, books and trinkets as well as 1,000 small mementos of a life, of their life together, his wife's, his children's, and his own. Within an hour, all was cleared away, carted off and shoved into the waiting vehicles, and then along with his wife and daughters, both living and deceased, all disappeared into the night, and he never saw the four of them ever again, until one morning, very many years later. Over those ensuing years, countless and regular missives, letters, parcels, and cards were issued forth from the Thrush residence at the typical and to be expected intervals, addressed to one or another or all of the self-exiled members of the family. These were directed to all the corners of the earth where the lonely patriarch believed his family might have found refuge, and established a new outpost of the Thrush lineage. Never was there the least response or reply, nor any hint that his fevered communiques, entreaties, pleas, inquiries, and well-wishing were ever received. Even during the early years of Thrush's banishment, when he issued numerous and frequent cries for help out upon the ethers, when curious and troubling developments threatened his well-being, his peace of mind, never was there the least flutter of interest or concern returned to the ancestral manse. All had eventually, with time, as is inevitable in most human affairs, settled down within the walls of Thrushdom and came to resemble something of an ordered routine. The house was impeccably maintained according to seasonal demands. Temperatures inside the house remained crisp to bracing, but the heat was not withheld when needed for the maintenance of good health and a modicum of basic comfort. Friedrich and Mathilde Eloise were never truly forgiven for their complicity in Felicity's abandonment of Thrush and her absconding with his surviving children on the night of Augusta Clarice's death. But they were peerless as household staff, and they knew the house and its numerous idiosyncrasies to precision and attended to them without complaint. As well they knew Elwood Addington Thrush to a degree that the lord of the house found them comfortable and would not have wished to suffer himself in the house the trouble and expense and the uncertainty of seeking out, hiring, and training new staff that in all likelihood would not be suitable at all to his tastes and various unique requirements of the house. So all that remained, as it remained for nearly 40 years. And then, on the occasion of her mother's death, and several years after the tragic loss of her two remaining sisters, Violet Marie Constance reached out to the only person yet to be informed of the sad news of the recent passing of her mother, her father. Thrush found it exceedingly good fortune that his daughter had called, that she was indeed in town, looking after various matters pertaining to her mother's considerable estates, and that she seemed completely amenable to a live and drive up the river to her childhood home and a tentative reunion with her elderly father. Friedrich and Mathilde Eloise were possessed of an enthusiastic hopefulness that had not graced the walls of the house for almost 4 decades. They smiled to each other as they closed the doors of the formal salon after serving their employer and his daughter, and accepting the woman's warm greetings and a brief word or two of shared memories. Then they retired to the kitchen to undo the work of the morning's preparations and put all aright once more in its proper order. It was something of a shock then, when a mere half-hour later the doors of the salon burst open and the sound of angry heels on the marble floor destroyed the soft silence of the house. These were joined by raised voices and, while of course they did not open the doors and peer out at their employer and his daughter, they made no attempt to hide themselves from what rose enough to become sensible to their ears. "I'm sorry, Father," Violet Marie said, almost in tears. "I should not have come. Mother warned me. Oh, how she warned me all those years while we were growing up," she continued. "Violet, my dear, please, come back to the table and finish your breakfast. Please?" the old man cried out plaintively. "What can I say? You must believe me," he pleaded. "Believe you? Father, I don't even know how to help you. You are truly mad." "No, Violet, no. I'm not mad, please. Didn't you see? At the table, while we ate. Give me a chance to explain. Surely you saw." "No, stop it, Father. I read all your letters. All those years, Mother had never let any of us see them. But she kept them. Saved them. I'm not sure why." Thrush's face brightened at this for the first time since his daughter's arrival. "You read them?" "Yes. When I was going through her things, I found them in a box, all organized by date and by year and by the recipient's name. Yes, she kept them." "Well, then you know. Please," he began, but she cut him off. "No, Father. No. I will not be a party to such madness, such... She faltered, her lips curling in disgust. "Father, you are not well, and I implore you to seek help. But this obsession, I cannot be a party to it. She sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I should not have come," she cried, and then fumbled around for her things. Mathilde Eloise heard all this and scurried from the kitchen to retrieve Violet's cape and hat in her bag. She handed the woman her things and then retreated to the kitchen, where she left the door ajar just an inch. Without even putting her cape on, Violet Marie grabbed at her hat and bag and hurried out the door and up the walkway, where she was helped into the waiting car by her driver, and then they were gone. Thrush was left standing in the doorway, watching as the car disappeared, trembling and wiping his brow with his hand before turning and going inside and closing the door. Elwood Addington Thrush sought neither the aid nor counsel of his servants, but retired straight away to the salon to contemplate the unfortunate and disappointing visit of his daughter, and how he could have ever been so foolish as to hope that after so long a time there was any reason to hope at all. He noted that the dishes had all been cleared away, and the table swept of crumbs, and now there was no longer the slightest evidence that Violet had ever been there, besides the pain and disappointment that filled the old man's heart. He sat down at the table and absently regarded the playing cards carefully arranged at his usual place on the table. His eyes narrowed as he picked up the cards and considered his hand as well as a variety of possible stratagems. His opponent was very shrewd and could be quite merciless at times and delighted at besting him at every turn, but he enjoyed certain other advantages. "I told you she wouldn't believe you," Thrush's opponent said triumphantly as she eyed her own cards with a satisfied smile. "She was never very imaginative." Augusta Clarice sat before him exactly as she had looked on that Christmas Eve so many years before, the precocious 12-year-old who had tumbled from the second-floor observatory mezzanine into the snow and died there. But let it never be presumed that the dead do not progress in other ways besides their appearances. "I had to try," Thrush protested sharply. "They're all gone now, really, gone," he muttered sadly. "No matter. I'm here, you're here, and we have Maddie and Friedrich to take care of us. He's such a dear, Friedrich is. He brought in my favorite blue roses for the breakfast. Wherever did he find them this time of year?" she said brightly. "Friedrich and Maddie believe in me," she continued. "They love me. And you, of course, Father," she said with a smile as she pretended to stretch and peek over at his cards. "Oh, my darling Augusta, perhaps I am truly mad after all," Thrush sighed. "Why, Father, of course you are. Really and truly mad, just as I am really and truly here. But you can be so silly at times. Whatever would you have done all these years without me and Maddie and Friedrich to take care of you?" she said, shaking her head. Then she got up and walked to the double doors which opened silently before her. "Friedrich, could you be a love and bring Father another pot of coffee?" she called out. "Very good, madam. And you, will the young miss be requiring anything special herself today?" Friedrich inquired from the kitchen. "No, I am perfectly fine," she replied, resuming her place at the table. "I have everything I need right here in this house, Friedrich. Thank you," she called out as she picked up her cards and eyed them narrowly. "Go on, Father. I do believe it's your turn."